Good evening and welcome. My name is Tom Williams. I'm visiting from New York City. My background, I mostly grew up in California, attended university at the United States Naval Academy. I was a nuclear engineer, naval officer, went to graduate school at the UCLA Anderson School, and then I spent the next 25 years working on Wall Street at various banks. Worked at a place called Payne Weber, Bear Stearns, Deutsche Bank. I've worked at some family offices. I do extensive research on the subjects that are relevant to financial services and to the economy. If I talk about any subjects today like politics, I don't particularly study politics unless it relates to business and finance. So the 5 subjects today that I would like to talk about would be, number 1, the dramatic changes in the U.S. education system of higher education in the United States. Also, the changes in the real estate market in the United States, focusing mostly on residential real estate, although there is a similar impact to corporate real estate. The 3rd subject will be how businesses are preparing for the potential change in the presidential election results. The 4th subject would be the U.S.-China relations and how they may or may not change due to the election. And lastly, any changes to the U.S. political party system that might be coming as a result of the contentious 2020 year, COVID, and all the fallout. It's a very difficult and contentious election, and while some people feel that the vote is finished and the results are in, I would challenge that and say that people's opinions have not changed overnight just because an election happened. Their views, their partisanship, their ideology is still strongly held, and it remains to be seen how they will reflect that in their future voting, in their future activism, and how the political parties reform themselves or reshape. I will start with my first topic, which is changes to the U.S. higher educational system due to COVID. In the United States, we call higher education university and graduate school, and COVID has had a dramatic impact. Let me preface it by saying that for the better part of 100 years or so, higher education in the United States has had a formula. And there's been a cost and there's been a return on investment that is widely accepted for people who attend university. And there's also just the general belief that it's the best for a population to be educated, and the benefits have been undeniable. Then about a couple decades ago, people started challenging this subject as it became more and more common that people who were very successful in their career did not attribute their time at university to their success, especially with the advent of big tech and social media. Infamously, many of the big tech billionaires either dropped out of college, did not attend college, or avoided college, and eventually started bragging that they didn't need college. And so there has been a growing debate about the cost and viability and necessity of higher education for quite a while. Couple that on top with the large increase in cost of a university degree. For the last couple decades, it's debatable which statistics you want to use, but no matter how you slice it, the cost of a university degree has dramatically outpaced inflation, dramatically outpaced the cost of living, and 8-fold, if you believe Forbes, 8-fold the increase in wages. And Forbes is the one that has a 2.6% annual increase. Other people have it at an 8% increase. But no matter how you slice it, if that is compounded over 2 decades, it's an enormous cost. And for those who attended university in the 90s or the late 80s, and you worked part-time to pay your way through school, and you graduated with little to no debt because you financed yourself, those days are gone. Those are not realistic in today's prices. And so there's already, before COVID, been a growing skepticism of the cost of higher education and the usefulness and the breakdown. Where does the money go? What's it being spent on? Are they too expensive? What's the value proposition? And then there's been, of course, the detractors who say, well, all these millennials who are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, it's because a large part of that is their bar tab, not necessarily their tuition and their books. So it's not a clean and simple discussion, but the point is there is an enormous number of millennials in the United States who are heavily in debt, still trying to pay off their university degree, and unfortunately the job market is not cooperating, and so they have a massive amount of student debt, and they are trying to get their career going, and it's not working out so well for them. Now, introduce 2020 where we have COVID, and let's talk about what changes COVID is making, and it is making all of these issues that were in progress come to the fore and become more important than ever before. As with many other issues that were in progress before COVID, have been accelerated. So the ugly truth, college presidents really don't have a choice. Universities have a very high fixed cost structure between unionization, between professor salaries, real estate, dorms. Their cost structure is very high fixed cost. They don't have flexibility to make cuts around the edges. And if students are not going to come to school because either politicians have mandated they don't come to school, or whether they're scared to come to school, or whether they've decided to do online classes, the cost of the tuition is very difficult to manage if students are not coming and staying in the dorms and attending class in person. The average salary of a full professor before benefits and administrative support costs, $104,000. And some make much more than that. And then you have tenure. Some universities have revenue streams, technology transfer, hospitals, multi-billion-dollar endowments that they can get returns. And some of them get public funding, and many have become tuition dependent. And so if the students don't return, they have a problem. There's some narratives that are going on. This is a couple of funny little quotes that I find very charming. This is unprecedented and we're in this together. And some people are saying, look, what that really means is we're not lowering our prices. We're going to maintain these prices for what has become overnight a dramatically less compelling profit offering. Well, you know, ask a parent who's spending $51,000 a year to send their kid to college, and now they find out, oh wait, you mean it's still $51,000, but little Bobby is staying at home in my house? Part of the benefit is little Bobby's no longer at home, and they can now use his bedroom for, you know, a study or for that little extra part-time job that you're working from home. So the value proposition has changed. And then they say to themselves, but wait a minute, $51,000 to take an online class? What am I paying for? So all of these are coming to the fore, and we're worried that some universities are not going to survive. So what have people proposed? So the first thing is people are now reevaluating what is the value of a college degree. What is the value? What is its cost? And then secondly, when the changes for COVID are in place, which universities are vulnerable and which ones are not? So some have come up with a formula. And if you want to break it down into three factors, you could say university has credential, university offers experience, and number three, it actually has an education. So what is the credential factor? Well, we could say it's the undergraduate admissions rate, right? The amount of times the college is named in a search on Google, or what's its rank in US News. If you want to look at experience, you could say, well, it's based primarily on a number of factors, but there's a website called niche.com that compares the culture of college campuses and student life. And then lastly is the education factor, and you can break that down, and very simply you could say it's a return on investment. So if you pay X amount of money today and you 15 years later have a really good job, and 30 years later you have an even better job, how much was your return on investment? Just one way of measuring the university value of the education. And then the last is, what is the cost that the schools actually spend on their students? So recently, a NYU professor, Scott Galloway, in July published an article that summarized his view of how he calculates these values and vulnerability. And it's a very in-depth analysis. I believe it's 441 universities. And his analysis came to the conclusion that 89 colleges would perish and 129 would struggle in the next coming months. And he made a spreadsheet and he did some analysis and he made a chart of 4 quadrants. So the 4 quadrants are thrive, survive, struggle, and be challenged. So for a school to thrive, his category, he would say these are the elite schools that offer strong value and have the opportunity to emerge stronger after the COVID because they consolidate the market, they double down on exclusivity, and they embrace big and small tech to increase the value with a decrease in cost to the student. So think about Harvard charging the same high tuition, but they reduce the cost because students are studying from home. Survive, schools that will see demand destruction and lower revenue, but will be fine. And they have their brand equity and the credential to cost ratio, and they have an endowment to weather the storm. Struggle, these are tier 2 schools, so they have 1 or 2 of these, what we call comorbidities. High admissions rates, because obviously we're not having students now, and they have an anemic wait list. So traditionally, when a school has lower admissions, they just go to the wait list, and they still fill the school with students from the admissions on the wait list. But if you have low to no wait list and your applicants fall, then you have less students overall, and then you have a problem, especially if your revenues are tied to student admissions. And secondly, you have high tuition, and you have little or no endowments to carry you over. So literally, you are cash flow thin. And lastly, there's a category called challenged, and that's when you have a really, what they call a sodium pentothal cocktail of high admission rates, high tuition, low endowments, dependence on international students, and a weak brand equity. Obviously, international students are even more challenged to go to school these days because of travel. And let's not forget that the new administration, the Trump administration, has restricted student visas if students are not going to be on campus. So now students have a dilemma. They want to go to school and the school is only offering online classes and they are a foreign student. They may or may not get a visa to attend class, which is another hindrance. So in Mr. Galloway's world, these are the 4 categories. These are the schools. It should not be surprised the schools you see in some of the categories. Certainly the Thrive. I don't think it surprises anyone that schools like Northwestern, Clemson, Harvard are all in the Thrive category. You might be surprised to see the schools that struggle or are challenged. And if that's the case, it's probably because you never checked to see what their endowment is. You didn't check their cost structure. You didn't lift up the hood to see their underlying issues, which are now going to be highlighted because of COVID. So let's, what is the latest breakdown of how schools are handling this? This is from the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's October 27th of this year, so it's only a month old. And the current, out of 3,000 colleges, 10% are fully online, 10%. 4% are fully in person, 3% are undetermined, and everybody else is a combination. And let me tell you, the combination makes a big difference. 60-40, 90-10, it's a big difference. Some people have said, well, let's look at what is a luxury brand. Some people have said universities are now a luxury brand. They said that the traditionally business school discussions are that brands are Coca-Cola, these large Mercedes-Benz, Apple. But there's a new argument now that maybe universities are a brand. And if you look at these elite schools that are private, MIT, Stanford, that maybe they are the luxury brand. And if you put them in that category, you could come to some analysis. You could say, well, let's look at their gross margins and let's look at the longevity of their brand. And if you just use those two metrics, you find something astonishing. Let's just look at the gross margin. If you have an example math class, 170 students, $7,000 per student to take that class, that's about a little less than 1.2 million. And they're taking 12 nights of a class in a classroom, which net is 100,000 per night. But if you're paying the faculty, $70K to teach that class, and you have some cleaning expenses and some rent expenses, net, you got a gross margin well into the 90 percentile. Very few companies have gross margins in the 90 percentile. And trust me, even if they do, it doesn't last. Colleges, their gross margins have been that high for a long time. So Hermes and luxury goods are usually 50 to 60%, 60 points in gross margin. So in summary, I guess what we're trying to say here is that colleges are going to go through a sea change in 2020 and 2021, and they may or may not be able to navigate based off of how they choose to market themselves, how they have an endowment or a state or a federal government to rescue them, or how they're able to convince students to come and pay regardless. But it's going to be a very difficult year, and there's limited flexibility for the university presidents because of the high cost structure. And there's a lot of people anxiously watching to see the fallout. And as we discussed, there's some that just really don't seem to have a chance of surviving. But the reality is, some would say, with a lot of other things with COVID, these trends were in place before COVID. The fact that they got accelerated to COVID is not completely a surprise, but there's certainly schools on the list of, struggle that really the prospects are not good. And let's see how it all shakes out, but it'll be an interesting development. Hopefully, if we are positive, good things will come out of this, and our education system will be more value offered for the money spent, and maybe the system will be leaner and more efficient. But it's also possible that we just create a whole new tier 1 set of colleges and a bunch of the middle colleges just disappear. It's hard to say, but keep an eye on these issues, and let's see how it develops. So the next subject is the changes due to COVID in the U.S. real estate market. So I will focus mostly on residential real estate, but there is a similar effect in corporate real estate, but let's just focus on residential. And before we do that, let's start with what is the trends that we've had for years and years before COVID. Before 2019, what were the trends? So the first trend is big businesses move into big cities. They pay big bucks to hire executives and staff, and there's an incentive for people to move to the big city out of the suburbs and take the big paycheck, spend the big paycheck on real estate, and enjoy themselves on all the benefits of a big city. Nice restaurants, plays, theater, potentially if you live in a big enough city, professional sports, concerts, music venues, lots of benefits and advantages to living in the big city, and resultingly real estate prices that reflect that. The other trend is that similarly, that pattern is also correlated to the economy. If the economy is doing well, businesses are doing well, they're paying bigger paychecks, and rent supply and demand becomes less balanced, and people will pay more for rent. So for all those reasons, and just as much for supply and demand as anything else, real estate prices or rent prices, both, have been highly correlated to the economy. If there's a booming economy, rent prices go up, housing prices surge. If there's a recession, people are forced, they lose their job, they can't pay their rent, they need to sell their home, rent prices and home prices drop. The interesting thing with COVID is both of those trends have been dramatically disrupted. Both have been dramatically disrupted. In fact, people are moving out of the big city and rent prices are dropping. So let's look at why is that. So, first of all, we got to distinguish between the home buyer and the home renter. The home buyer is the affluent worker who has, in theory, mostly a white-collar job with higher wages and less impact due to COVID. COVID is not affecting white-collar workers as much as it is blue-collar workers. If you look at the protests that were happening across the country, the businesses that were being shut due to restaurants and small business owners that are being closed, the numbers of employees that are adversely affected are mostly blue-collar workers, lower wage workers. In the terms of this discussion, we would call them renters. The people who are supervisors at, big companies, ABC company with Madison Avenue offices, those jobs have been less impacted, and so their interest in buying has been less affected. So what are the effects of COVID on migration? So first and foremost, and it's been a surprise to many people, there's been a mass migration, not just a little, a mass migration out of the big city into the suburbs. One reason is that people don't want to be so close to each other in a COVID environment. That's certainly the case in New York City and true in other cities. People want to be socially distant, and they certainly don't want to be on top of each other. They're also not comfortable with mass transit. People are not as comfortable being on a bus, even an Uber. People look at the seat in an Uber when they step inside and they think, how many people sat in this seat 5 minutes ago and all day before I sat in it? And they don't believe that the Uber driver is sanitizing that seat every time a new person gets in. So people are hesitant to do these kinds of things, and the result is they want to move somewhere where it's not as congested. They also want to live somewhere where it's less costly. If they pay rent, they want to move to the suburbs, and they're willing to pay less to commute from the suburbs, especially if they're working from home. If you're working from home 3 days a week, then you're willing to commute a longer commute for those 2 days than you would be if you had to commute all 5 or 6 days to the office. Now you add in that prices were, in generally, before COVID, prices were cheaper in the suburbs. And then lastly, let's not forget, with all the people working from home, people need more space at home. So in a previous world, if you were 30 years old and you had 2 roommates and you lived in a 3-bedroom apartment, and 2 of you were working from home, where are you working from home? Are you shutting yourself into your bedroom and sitting at your desk all day and you're both sharing the kitchen? If people thought they had roommate issues previously when they were working at the office, imagine now that they're on top of each other 24/7, not just post-work. Imagine a family. In fact, I have a quote here from NPR that I thought was very interesting. They quoted Caroline Wells and her husband were working remotely from their home in San Antonio, and they had 2 young children. And she said the moment of her worst moment was when she had to do a focus group that they wanted to do for company to be working from home. And she said that the Zoom call kept freezing. The Zoom call was freezing because everyone in the house was on the Wi-Fi at the same time, because kids weren't in school, parents were home, everyone was using Wi-Fi at the same time. So her focus group about what are the problems from working from home, and her Zoom was freezing because she was working from home. And so she realized, well, her son is on the Wi-Fi, and he had a little fort that he had built. So she had to leave the call to go get her son to log out of the Wi-Fi so that she could use the Wi-Fi. And then she had the noise from the apartment, and she ended up having to go into the closet to get some privacy. And she realized, here I am doing a focus group on what is the problems with working from home, and I can't do it because I'm working from home. The other is cost. You know, like I said, and this is even more true for not just big city and suburbs, the biggest of the big cities, the top 8 cities, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, LA. All these cities are going through a similar transition, a massive exodus to the suburbs. And the cities with the priciest cities are seeing the sharpest rent declines. Like I said, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Oakland, San Jose, Washington, D.C., LA, and Seattle. The median price in these 8 cities has decreased 15% from the start of the year. So let's look at real estate sales. So like I said before at the beginning, the trend traditionally is when there's a recession, and there was a recession when we first broke into COVID, that home sales will decline. And that's very consistent with this chart. In fact, you see a nice 1 month to 2 month lag between when the effects were starting and the actual sales were decreasing. But the difference this time is the spike on the right of now prices are rising and home sales are increasing. And why is that? Because people are moving out of the city for more space. If you have someone working from home, you want an extra bedroom. Well, the best place to get an extra bedroom and to save some money while you do that is to move to the suburbs. So add on top of that, you have millennials who are just now finally at the place in their life where they want to buy a home, and they've been putting it off because of college debt and because of a poor job market since the great financial crisis. Now they finally feel is the time. They're reaching a certain age, they're reaching a certain income level, and they're also needing to move because of COVID, and it all matches up to, let's just get a house in the suburbs. And it's so common that this is what's happening. So if you look at the statistics, sales of previously owned homes have climbed back after dropping in the spring. In June, sales of existing homes jumped more than 20%, which at the time was a record. But then in July, they went up 25%, and an annual rate of 5.86 million. So the record was in June, but then July beat the record again. You see a record in median home prices in July, $304,000. That's up 8.5%. But if you check the economy, how's the economy doing? How's the GDP? Not so great. How many people are filing for unemployment? A whole bunch. Record numbers of people on unemployment. Congress is passing stimulus bills, and yet home prices are surging. $304,000 average price, up 8.5% from a year earlier. Like I said in the beginning, historically it should be down. Not only is it down, it's up a record. And some people would say the last issue is interest rates. Yes, interest rates are down. They're getting lower and lower, and what used to be zero is now getting even lower. And in my world, we talk about negative real rates because we have no inflation and we have interest rates at zero. We have negative real rates. So every 25 basis points of a mortgage adds up. People forget 25 basis points doesn't sound like a lot because it's 1/4 of 1%. But if you do it over 30 years and you do it on a $500,000 home, that's meaningful money. What's that? $40,000. That's an incentive to buy a house. Technology. For quite a while now, technology has been revolutionizing the real estate market. 20 years ago, if you wanted to buy a house, you had to pay a real estate broker to do a whole bunch of things for you, and you gave them 6% of the price of the house. And even at that time, with all the work they were doing, people still felt like that's a lot of money. Oh my God, I'm overpaying. And at the time, the person would have to go to the apartment, snap some still photos with a camera, not their phone, but an actual camera, print out some still photos, unlock the door on Saturdays to show the apartment to people, and haggle with them, and show them around, and then to publicly list the home for sale on a monopolized MLS system so that regular people didn't have access to it, and then they would charge 6%. And even in then, people felt like that's a lot of money, $1 million home, that's a lot of money. But now, with technology, you can have online photos, multiple photos, not just one. You can see a photo of every room in the house. You can see a video of the house. And if you're really getting a luxury house, there's even a drone that will fly over the property and take a video of the property from the outside so that you can almost make the decision without even visiting the home. In fact, it's a rising percentage of homes have been bought without the person ever visiting the home. Historically, people would say, oh, that's foolish. Today, that's not so foolish anymore. Sure, people could make a mistake, but the point is technology is intermediating that space and making it much more accessible to people and cutting into the cost of buying a home and the infrastructure of moving real estate. So in summary, COVID has been a dramatic shift in buying patterns, in renting patterns, in real estate as a whole. In New York City, I have the personal opinion that one of the issues with New York when you move there from out of state, as I did, you have very small apartments, you have very high rent prices, and people suffer through this for the privilege to live in such a vibrant city with so much to do and great jobs and great salaries. But now with COVID, those things are changing. Great jobs are no longer necessarily there. Even if you work at a good company, you may not even be required to be in the office. All the restaurants are being closed. Live music is being shut down. Pro sports is shut down. What is the incentive to be in New York City if all these things are not open and don't plan to really reopen anytime soon? And do you really want to live in a small dinky apartment when you have work from home days? If you're working from home 2 days a week, do you want to be in a studio? So these things are problematic and changes are in the way. And people are moving to Brooklyn, people are moving to New Jersey, and that trend is not likely to change dramatically in the near term. It might slow compared to the rapid explosive growth that it's been in 2020, but it's not clear that that trend will revert back to the past, and almost certainly won't revert back to the past once we get a vaccine and once we get back to whatever your term for normal is. It's not likely that it will reverse back to the old. There will be some version of new normal, and I believe it will be larger apartments, lower rents, more work from home, and more people commuting. And it's a whole separate subject, but used cars spiking as well. Similar to real estate, you would think that those trends should be decreasing, but because no one wants to be in an Uber, nobody wants to be in public transportation, used car prices are spiking. People are buying used cars because they need a car to get to work now that they live in the suburbs. So a lot of changes, and we'll see how it plays out, but don't expect it to go back to normal. Expect it to go back to a new normal. The next subject Ah, my European friends love this subject, the changing of the presidency. So let me just first start by saying I have no comment or opinion about the changing and the counting of the votes and the recounting, and let's just leave that aside. But to the extent that we do have a change and we do have a President Biden, what is corporate America doing in response to that? So let's start with the first misunderstanding. The original discussion, 6 months ago, after COVID was pretty active and people felt like that COVID might be a reason to choose one candidate over another, there was a prediction of a blue wave. So let's define the blue wave. A blue wave would be a Democratic president, a House of Representatives that kept their majority of Democrats, and potentially the Senate, which had been Republican, would flip and become Democratic. So in the traditional speak of politics, you have all three willing party members of the same ideology able to enact a lot of policy changes. Okay, but what actually happened at the election is not necessarily what some people expected to happen. Yes, Biden potentially has won the election, and the House of Representatives lost Democrats' seats. So now they have less ability to enact new policy. And the Senate did not flip and become Democratic, but there is one last development remaining. If you look here, you can see the numbers as the Associated Press has them. They've predicted 306 electoral votes for Biden, which would give him the victory. And you can see he got 81 million votes. Trump got 74 million. So to put that in perspective, both candidates got more votes than any candidate in history. So it was a very large turnout. The Democrats have lost 9 seats in the House of Representatives where they had hoped to gain seats. And let's look at the Senate. Previously, there was a Republican majority, and now they have lost 1 seat, and there's 2 that are now in a runoff. So to put it as simply as a summary can be, those last 2 seats can determine whether the Senate is 50-50 or 50-46 for the Republicans. If the 2 remaining runoff elections, which will happen January 5th, if those become Republican, then the Democrats will be able to use the tiebreaker vote, which is the vice president, in this case, potentially a Democrat. They can enact legislative changes that are more consistent with the platform that Mr. Biden ran on, which has some progressive policies and has some more changes in their platform. If they lose those 2 seats, then we can go back to what is a divided presidency, and you will have gridlock. And for a lot of people who are not wanting these progressive changes, they feel more comfortable. So in effect, the changing of the presidency could be very muted if those 2 seats do not go Democratic. So January 5th, the world of U.S. politics, all eyes are on Georgia. The president will probably be flying there, certainly the president-elect. Everyone and anyone who's contributed money, who's of value to either political party, will be massively invested in those 2 previously mostly unnoticed Senate seats that are going for re-election. So let's see how those turn out. But if, as expected, they do not flip and do not become Democratic, then the policy changes that we're going to talk about will be very much muted. But we don't know, and so people are anxious and trying to plan ahead. So the 2 candidates, I listed them here. The separate issue is that in only a couple days, December 14th, the Electoral College is supposed to certify the presidential election. There is a debate because the current administration has been challenging the results in several of the states. Like I said, that's beyond the scope of this presentation, but just suffice it to say that it will be interesting to see how the Electoral College can verify an election when there's still challenges to the accuracy of the vote counting. But in all cases, January 5th is super important because even if Trump were to stay, if he loses the Republicans in the Senate, his policies will be muted. So January 5th is the very important upcoming date, although some people would say December 14th. We'll see. So what are the items of concern? So Biden has proposed a different stimulus package. Let's just start with the short term. The Democratic Party proposed the HEROES Act, $3 trillion of stimulus to the U.S. economy. The Republicans have proposed $1 trillion. There was a massive debate, there was some political posturing, and nothing got done. This week, they are now debating less than $1 trillion, $900 billion. Those who are political like to say that, well, that's because the outcome of the votes showed that the Democrats' positioning was not as strong as they had proposed themselves, and the conservative fiscal senators don't feel comfortable spending $3 trillion when they feel like the amount they've already spent is doing its job. But the point is that the stimulus package will be dramatically less if we don't get the two senators from Georgia. Will be less if you don't get them, and it will be dramatically bigger if they do. If they get the two senators from Georgia, the stimulus could very likely be $3 trillion. If they don't, it will be as current, which could be $900 billion, dramatically smaller. Corporate tax rate. The Democrats want to raise the corporate tax rate. We'll get into that in the next slide, I believe. They want to raise it from 21% to 28%. We can debate that if you'd like, but in general, the U.S. tax rate before Trump was, I believe, 35%, one of the highest in the world. And consequently, we had very large companies in the U.S. who were headquartering themselves abroad. Apple was headquartered in Ireland for tax purposes. And here we have one of the largest, well, now it is the largest company in the world by market cap, and they were almost tax-free because of their headquarters. When the last administration lowered the tax rate to bring them back on board to the U.S. and now start paying U.S. taxes, one of the reasons they brought the tax rate down to 21%. And now Biden says he wants to go up to 28. It's at the higher end of the range if you look at where other large countries are. I'm not sure that the impact will be enormous. It might be individually better for one or two companies and worse for one or two. I'm not sure that there'll be a big managerial change based off of that. But the income tax change is definitely very worrisome. Wealth managers are very worried about the estate tax changes. Currently, there is, estate tax is excluded for a wealthy family to pass on to their children for everything below $11.5 million. If Biden has his way, meaning that they get the two senators in Georgia to be Democratic, then that could drop, the exclusion could drop to $5 million. And remember, that's a 40% tax. So wealth managers all across the United States are having conversations with their very wealthy older clients who have potentially a large estate to pass on to their next generation. Do they want to pass that estate on in 2020 before the rise in taxes? But now we're unsure, so they're debating it. The other is individual tax brackets will go higher, 37% to the highest at 39.6. Social Security tax and capital gains. In the United States, capital gains, long-term capital gains, has been taxed at 20% as an incentive for people to have their money in the stock market. If Biden if he's able to pass legislation the way he would like to raise that to ordinary income tax rates. So again, that would be positive for the U.S. Treasury as far as raising revenues, but obviously not positive for the stock market. Regardless of how you slice it, whether you want to say this is COVID related or whether this is tax related, large American companies are moving significant portions of their staffing outside of the larger cities. Notably, two recent, Goldman Sachs moving their staff to Florida and Tesla moving manufacturing to Texas. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has been very vocal about his displeasure about how the California politicians have managed the blue state of California. He's very upset about the taxes. He's very upset about the legislation and how they work their employees. And so he's decided to move his manufacturing to Texas, where it is a very low-cost state and less political interference. But this is a trend that's happening with U.S. Residential real estate, as we talked about before, and with high net worth individuals. They're moving out of the bigger cities, and I didn't mention this earlier, but their destinations of choice have been Texas, Florida, southern states with much lower taxes. Florida and Texas, I believe, have 0 state taxes, whereas New York State has sizable taxes. California has sizable taxes. So if your federal tax is going higher, your state tax is high, your city tax is high, many wealthy people are moving for tax purposes separate from the other issues that we talked about before. And now we're seeing that companies are doing the same. Goldman Sachs doesn't need a trading desk supported by admin people who are in the same office. The admin people can work from remotely. And if they're going to work remotely, why do they want to pay them wages to support them living in a fancy part of Brooklyn? It's a suburb, but it's still pricey compared to other places. Why don't they just work in Florida? The weather's warmer, they can pay a lot less, and for the person working, the cost of living can be managed. They can figure out a lower salary that keeps the employee equivalent to work in Florida for a much lower pay than the equivalent pay of living in New York. So the question comes in is that when the Trump administration lowered the corporate tax rate, did it actually have a meaningful impact on corporations moving back to the US? And did it have the desired impact? So it's actually two questions, believe it or not. So one question, yes, a lot of companies did move back to the US, Apple being noteworthy. Like I said, it was a top 10 largest company in the world. Now it is the single largest company. And they did move from Ireland back to the US. So quite a few companies did move back. And from that perspective, that was meaningful to the extent of what we call new company formation. New companies every day are deciding where to capitalize themselves and headquarter themselves. And obviously they see a much lower tax rate and they're more incentivized to have offices in the United States. But when it comes to the total desired effect, there is a debate, and it's beyond the scope of this, but there is a discussion about, well, what happens to all those savings? And what are the companies doing with those reduced tax rates, the ones that were already here? So how did they spend that money? So in an ideal world, if you ask a Republican, they would tell you, oh, the money trickles down and it's spread amongst the employees, it's spread amongst the healthcare system, it's spread amongst the population as a whole, and it's good for everybody. But it is also true that the way the current infrastructure, the way the current system is set up, a lot of companies did use that money to buy back stock. So shareholders were enriched, company executives were enriched, and if you were a middle-class person with no stock holdings, you did not participate. that is certainly another, back to this subject, certainly part of the analysis here. Biden wants to limit stock buybacks. One of the discussions about bailouts has been, are the companies that we're bailing out, do they deserve a bailout when they bought back significant amounts of stock? So the one that's under the radar the most is airlines. Airlines have traditionally been very difficult stocks to own. They're very cyclical. They don't perform well. Warren Buffett used to say, I'll never own an airline. And then a few years ago, they started introducing fees, legroom fees, luggage fees. Everyone hates them, the customers hate them, but it has made the airlines profitable, and even Warren Buffett started buying airlines because it added a lot to the bottom line. But here's the issue. When those tax rates went down, the airlines did not put money away for a rainy day. They did not plan ahead for drops in demand, and they bought back a lot of stock, which made shareholders very happy. But when the rainy day came, a pandemic, now they need money from the government. And people are saying, if you bought back too much stock, maybe you deserve to go out of business. Some people would say, well, it's a pandemic. Who can expect a pandemic? It comes once every 100 years. Somewhere in between the two is obviously the answer. But to be clear, it is new. People now have a revised opinion about how much money airlines should have saved for a rainy day. They probably don't expect them to save for a pandemic, but they certainly think that they should be saving more than they are. And the same thing for banks. The banks have now been under scrutiny for paying outsized dividends, and yet they potentially might need money because of the pandemic. And some former Fed officials and former regulatory officials have said, well, maybe dividends should be paused right now because we're in an uncertain area and we have a pandemic. And it's not a consensus, but the point is there's discussions. And obviously when there's discussions, things can happen. So the desired effect of the lowering of the corporate taxes, they did meet some expectations, and then there's some naysayers who felt like they didn't in certain areas. So here's the chart I was talking about corporate tax rates. You can see that a large majority of them are in the range of 20 to 25%. So if the US goes to 26, noteworthy is that it does not go back to the previous high of 35, which was before Trump, but it does go back to the higher end of the range, as it were. And some would say, if you are short on tax revenues because of a recession, because of a pandemic, this is certainly a way to raise tax revenue without being extreme. We will find out. In my opinion, I think this is certainly one of the more realistic and positive ways to raise tax revenue. The others might be more problematic. So other changes from the Biden administration: infrastructure spending, green energy spending, and regulations. So in my world, very interestingly, there's an ETF called TAN, T-A-N, represents a lot of solar and green energy companies. And back when the blue wave theory was popular, the ETF was skyrocketing as investors were anticipating a blue wave. Then when it turned out there was not a blue wave, it pulled back. But regardless, there is a belief that Biden will focus more on green energy, and he says more jobs that will go with it. That remains to be seen, but I think it's consensus opinion that renewable energy will be a much higher focus with the Biden administration, as will regulations. So that includes financial regulations, so banks, stocks, and regulation on energy and on climate control. So the debate of whether that will cost us revenues from businesses and hurt the economy or help the economy, like I said, depends on those two Georgia senators. If they both become Democratic, we may soon find out, for better or for worse. If those senators become Republican and it's a divided Congress, then the likelihood of large changes will be muted because he'll have to get Republicans to vote for it, and they are not necessarily inclined to all the progressive strategies. One last comment, the choice of cabinet members is being closely watched. If you see who he nominates for Secretary of the Treasury, if you see who he nominates for key positions that will be in charge of these changes, such as regulatory, then you will get a much better idea of what his plans are as far as his ability or desire to be progressive. We'll get to that in the next subject. But there is a debate within the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. How progressive do they want to be? Obviously, they would love to be very progressive because they can make everybody in their party happy. But to get elected, he had to move to the center, and we can talk about that in the next subject. But the point is, he's been running as a moderate, and especially if the Senate does not become Democratic, it will be a divided House, and we'll see how much can get done. It may not be dramatically different than the previous administration. So the next subject is U.S.-China relations. There are people who have been asking what to expect there. I'll start with the preface as a former military person. For thousands of years, there is a trend that is still in place. When there is a superpower or one dominant power, and there is a rising worthy successor or a counter power that's rising, there is always a tension. And as the superpower starts to have reached the peak and starts to diminish in their power and influence and their wealth, and that creates its own issues for that country. The country that is becoming number 2, number 3 to number 2 and starting to rise and challenge the superpower has their conflicting issues, power, influence, goals. Those have always been problematic. Those have always, for thousands of years, had a pattern of how they get resolved. And how they get resolved is there's a slow boiling, rising tension. And unless one of the powers gets completely dismantled, that tension has a formula that has always been the case. The rising power wants more influence. They want preferential treatment. They want better terms. Their people are growing in prosperity. They expect things. They have the ability to influence those things because of their prosperity. And that is the underlying theme that should be overarching regardless of anything that we talk about regarding U.S. politics, and the relations between the U.S. and China. So those, to me, are the most important criteria. Everything we talk about here is just supplementing and icing on the cake, as they say, that is important, but still not superseding that structure and that tension that's going to always be there. So far, if I had to, put that original discussion into perspective, China's military is not what we would consider to be a superpower. Economically, they're the number 2 largest economy in the world. They overtook Japan a couple years ago. They certainly have a expanding sphere of influence that they would like to pursue, and the earth is only so big, so every time one country's sphere of influence is expanding, somebody else is decreasing. And when China's sphere of influence expands, regardless of how you slice it, that cuts into other countries' sphere of influence. That cuts into their economics, their trading partners, their rights, their shipping lanes, their defense positioning, all these things. And that's just a natural part of life of growing as a country. But we have the short term, which is a change in presidency. We have a rise in technology that is becoming global. We have a global economy now. And these are other issues that are very important, and they're contributing, but they're not altering that underlying primary dynamic regardless. They're just adding nuances and twists. So let's talk about what does Biden say he wants to do? So first, let's recap what Trump did. Trump took issues that America has had with China and brought them to the forefront. So it has long been known before before the Obama administration, that there has been tension with China over forced technology transfer, security, with human rights issues, technology theft. All of these things have been around, but no one had the ability, desire, gravitas, however you want to call it, to confront China about it. And those issues are only growing. They're not diminishing. They're not staying the same. They're only growing. And Trump was able to put that together and bring it to the front, however you want to describe it, whether he felt entitled to do it, whether his base supported him as he moved forward. He ran as an unconventional president. He felt free to break traditional norms. And he certainly challenged a lot of things with China that they're not comfortable being challenged on. And so a Biden administration feels the pressure to not give up the successes that Trump had made, because then it will seemingly diminish them, that maybe, people should be deciding on the president between those two because Biden would be weak on China. So there is a push for him to be strong on China and not to let go. And what he has said and what he's willing to do remains to be seen. But what he has said is that he still wants to be tough on China. He said that he believes that there's a better approach to resolving these differences. Some people feel like that's weakness. Some people feel like that's just being a more professional and polished politician. It remains to be seen. But Biden has publicly said to a lot of happy listeners that he believes the better way to negotiate with China, instead of unilaterally and instead of with tariffs, which can be contentious, argumentative, negative, he has proposed that we work with other countries to, as a coalition, coerce China to change their ways. Okay? So let's talk about what those issues are. Economic reforms, intellectual property. Like I said, it's been 2-3 decades that China has been stealing intellectual property. If you have any relations in the entertainment business, you will know that they are, for decades, been upset and thrown in the towel and almost given up. That when they make a movie, when they have certain intellectual property that they have created, it gets stolen. I think there was a guy named Kim.com who was pirating movies. If you've lived in New York City, you know that you used to walk down Canal Street and get the latest movie that came out yesterday as a DVD for $4, but it's a pirated copy. If you go to China, you can buy Louis Vuitton bags, you can buy all kinds of very luxury goods. You can see movies that are copyrighted, all with no government protections, no protections for the American company who made them, and billions and billions of dollars of lost revenue for American ingenuity and corporations, because the US does not have the ability to influence all of that intellectual property theft. So forced technology transfer. When a company wants to do business in China, China has historically said for a long time, if you do business in our country, you have to do certain parts of your business have to be locally done. On the surface, that sounds a reasonable compromise until you realize that sometimes that involves giving away the secret sauce. And you have to let a Chinese supervisor to manufacture your product, and you have to give them the ingredients so that he can do it. If you are a designer, if you make dresses, and you have manufacturing in China because it is low cost, which is very common in the fashion industry, guess what? The guy who runs the shop, who makes the dresses, He gets a blueprint of your dress emailed to his inbox, and he can make as many as he wants. He ships some back to the US as your request, but do not think for a second you're going to sell that dress for the same full price in Beijing or Shanghai, because he's already doing it, because he's got the recipe, and the Chinese government is not going to support you in a copyright infringement. National security. The Trump administration made a big deal out of security, and it turns out that Huawei, which is at the forefront of the 5G revolution with 5G technology, depending on who you listen to, there is a backdoor in their technology that allows the government to see into wherever it is being deployed. If you ask Huawei, they say, well, that's a coincidence. That's just how we built the infrastructure and the architecture. If you ask the company, they have Americans running the company, and they say, we're Americans, we would never let that happen. But if you really get down to the fine print, it is a Chinese company. And if the Chinese government mandates that they want to raid the headquarters and take that information, there's nothing we can do. So the question is, well, what can we do? Our 5G is behind Huawei, but we don't want to give away a backdoor hole to all of our infrastructure on 5G in the United States to the Chinese government. So it's a quandary. So one of the suggestions has been that Huawei become, a fully American company, or that we just don't adopt their technology. Let's see how Biden works on this. Sadly, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me like if Biden decides to let Huawei be the technology that we use, it won't be during his administration that we find out how problematic that will be. I don't think China's going to start stealing the information within 4 years. But once it's in place and once everyone's using it, it's there. So let's see how he handles it, but it is certainly a contentious issue. It has become an international issue. The US administration is asking other countries to not work with Huawei, to use US technology. But the difficulty is, apparently Huawei is better than our 5G. So other countries are asking, why are we doing you a favor? You're asking us, we don't care about the security hole. We don't have anything that China wants to steal. We would rather just have the better technology for a better price. We're doing you a favor if you ask us to not use Huawei. We'll see. Same thing with TikTok. As someone said that I like a lot, they said, if you take away TikTok from my 16-year-old daughter, you're going to face severe consequences. But again, this is another situation where we all know, I think it's pretty well documented now, social media operates on a free basis because they're accessing our personal information. When you post on Facebook, Facebook makes money. They don't charge you to everything they do on Facebook, but the reason they do that is because they take information off of everything that you post, everything you do, your phone number, your pictures, where you are, what you're doing, and they sell it. And it's now become pretty common knowledge that this happens, and some people are okay with it, some people are not. But when it comes to TikTok, now you have this information going to China, not to a US company, not to Mark Zuckerberg. People may or may not like the guy. But it's a very different discussion if the Chinese government can have access to that. But try to explain that to your 14-year-old daughter who's addicted to TikTok, that she needs to take one for the team and give up her TikTok account because the Chinese government might be getting too much information. Very difficult discussion. Let's see how they handle that. Human rights abuses. People who are Chinese living in the United States, they write a dissertation critical of the Chinese government, and the Chinese government contacts the internet service provider who does their emails, demands access, and because of their agreements between the countries, they must give it, because if you are Google, Gmail, if you're doing business in China, the criteria is if the government asks, you must give. So they give away the ISP. The dissident has his emails tracked by the government of China. The government of China sees the dissident is propagating information that they don't like. They send someone to come collect him and bring him back to China, and they torture him. you know, where's the line? If an American company is doing business in China, they have to follow Chinese law. You know, but do they feel bad that this Chinese American who lives in America and who wants American values is being tortured for his political beliefs? Yeah, they feel bad. But where's the rule? Where's the line? Let's see how these things get decided. And then Hong Kong. If you haven't been following the news, the Chinese government has been cracking down on the personal freedoms and liberties of Hong Kong citizens. It's been a massive debate. It's been a massive fight, and it's still ongoing. But from any American perspective, the Hong Kong citizens' rights and autonomy has been challenged, and China is not doing a good job of allowing them to be independent. And how much do we want to be involved in that discussion to begin with? You know, is it really our place to stand up for Hong Kong residents? Well, we'll see. But these are all part of the disagreements. Military-wise, as I said before, there's spheres of influence. There's the Philippines. There's there's lots of waterways that China has at one time over the course of thousands of years been able to control. And then they lost control, and then they got back control, and they lost control. And now that they are a much wealthier country with a much stronger military, they kind of want them back. But other people have been using them and don't want to give them back. We'll see. But the pattern has been that China takes, and they want you to take it back. And I'm not sure the Biden administration is interested in military actions. So we'll see how that plays out. Is there any more questions about U.S.-China relations? So the question is about U.S.-Taiwan relations as it relates to China. And again, very sensitive issue, very much like Hong Kong. Taiwan wants to be independent. They feel like they are independent. China feels like they are the lost child that's trying to get away, and they don't want them to get away. The Americans historically have always supported republics and countries that want to be autonomous and to be their own. But China, in this particular case, is very particular about China. They're very mindful. They're very upset that anyone that challenges that. But then some people say, this is Asia. Why are we meddling? Why are we intervening in Taiwan? So it's not a clear answer. Biden certainly hasn't made any announcements as to how that might change or might not change. Again, on a lot of these things, I think it goes back to the cabinet positions. You know, if Elizabeth Warren gets a cabinet position, she's going to look to dismantle some of these large cap tech companies, which will by definition affect U.S.-China relations. If he picks Janet Yellen, maybe not. And a lot depends on these two senators in Georgia. It's amazing. It all comes back to Georgia. So we'll see. But to answer the question more directly, I would say I don't see much change. And the reason would be because he didn't run his platform off of any of this. The one thing that was in his platform that he did run off of was that he wanted to be tough on China, and he didn't want to be perceived as a vote for Trump would mean tough on China, a vote for him would not. So many believe, including me, it'll probably still be a hardline stance on China. And unless something flares up, we won't see a change. But if something flares up and he's forced to make a decision, then we'll have to see. He hasn't declared either way, so we don't know. Okay, so the next subject, reshaping U.S. political parties. So this is something that nobody else is really talking about, and I have my own personal research and opinions on. But I think it's very interesting, especially when you consider the contentious nature of the 2020 elections and how the positioning was going into the election. The passion, the fervor, the voter turnout, the massive voter turnout, much larger than any in history. It seems to me that there is little chance that that doesn't carry forward. It seems to me that it's very unlikely that all of that went into voting in November, all of a sudden dissipates and everyone goes back to where they were in 2019. I just don't see it. What I do see is that you have a two-party system, and I've long said this even before Trump. A two-party system in a large country like the United States, 336 million people, is just very difficult to manage. There are too many different opinions, too many different people, and the example I use, look at France. They're not even as populous as the US, but they have 4 parties. How could the US, other than legacy and being forced into it, how can you encapture 336 million people's collective ideology, their views on the world, their views on healthcare, their views on big government, small government? How can you capture all that in 2 parties? And even before Trump was elected, I had suggested that we have really 4 ideologies. If we were France, we'd have 4 parties, but 2 are stuffed into one and 2 are stuffed into the other. So I believe, very much like other countries, we have a far left and we have a moderate left, and we have a far right and a moderate right. That was before Trump. Trump came along, and interestingly, he just obliterated the original Republican Party. In fact, one of my favorite memes of that election is the tombstone that says, "Rest in peace, Republican Party 2016." And in effect, if you think about what a Republican stood for in the 60s and 70s, very conservative, anti-gay, anti-abortion, Bible, Christian religion, almost less between church and state, small government. That traditional model has been obliterated by Trump. So the few who remained after Trump got elected, he squeezed them out of Congress. Between him and McConnell, they got kind of squeezed out. There's very few of those people left. Could they come back? I don't know. But my point is that viewpoint seems to be antiquated and doesn't seem to be consistent with current popular opinions. Most people don't see gay people as burning in hell. It's just not a consensus opinion that may have been the case in the 50s. Abortion has a very different opinion than it did, in the 1950s. Conservatism in general. What are the points of being a conservative? Yes, fiscal conservative has kind of stayed the same, but I would even argue that has shifted. People used to believe unless you balance the budget, you're irresponsible. I would argue that today even conservatives are willing to not balance the budget pretty consistently because they've seen how the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Doesn't make it right or wrong. It doesn't mean that 100 years from now it'll be a problem. But I'm saying that the consensus opinion of what is considered a fiscally conservative person, that you must always balance your budget, is not the same as it was 20 years ago. So I think when you look to the right side of the equation, I think that first of all, there will be a vacuum when Trump leaves. But secondly, the question is, who do they want to be going forward? Who will they look to for their advice, their ideology, their platform? So clearly you could just wait for the next star to arrive and to lead the party forward. Or, as we highlight here, there is a view that's growing, and I can't claim to be the only one, that Trumpism is here to stay. So the man himself might exit, but even if he exits and the Biden administration comes in, the view of his policies is still widely popular, very, very widely accepted. He got 74 million votes for a reason. Okay? People forget that while the election is pass-fail, as we say in academia, there is still a difference between a landslide, a blue wave, and a vote that's so close that it's being contested. And if 74 million people, by the way, that's the most people that have ever voted for a candidate in the history of the United States, except Mr. Biden. So out of all the presidential elections we've ever had, no candidate ever got 74 million votes except for Mr. Biden. So there is wide acceptance of his ideology, his beliefs, So let me just slide forward a little bit. So again, Neil Ferguson, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's a leading proponent of this as well. And if you look at the House and Senate votes, the House of Representatives lost Democratic votes. They lost 9 representatives. The Senate did not become a blue wave and did not become all Democrats. At best, it'll be 50-50. That's the best hope they have, and it's not clear. And at the moment, the odds are they still won't get both of those seats in Georgia. And I don't say that to be predictive or to have an opinion. I say it as a fact, meaning that the reason that that happened is because people voted a certain way, which means people have an opinion of a certain ideology and a certain view in how they want their government run. That's the only reason I mention it. I'm unpolitical myself. This, I think, is kind of a picture that I think is kind of the way forward. You know, even if the man exits, this will still be in a very large number of people's homes in the United States. Some are even going so far to say that the man might run again. I think it's way too early to have any of those opinions. But let's go back to let's discuss the left. So one thing I also had said at the 2016 election is that Bernie Sanders has a large and fervent and very spirited group of people who support his extremely progressive views. His views are very progressive. Like I said before, I agree he may not do it, but he had said he wants oil executives in jail. That's how much he believes in new energy. Most people would say that's pretty problematic because you can't support and run the economy on new energy yet. It's just not ready. Again, he also wants all colleges to be free. He wants to forgive all student debts. He wants to approve the Green New Deal. So just as a quick sidebar, I find this interesting to people who support the Green New Deal, because when you read it, it sounds really interesting. Green energy, pay for student debt, all these great things. And then of course the person who introduced it is, she says, we can pay for it over time. Well, I did the math. I think if you have 327 million Americans, I think, I can't remember the exact number, but I think we have 149 million who pay taxes. If you divide that into the cost of the Green New Deal, which is, I believe, 80 trillion, I'm sorry if I don't have the numbers exactly right. The cost to each taxpayer who pays taxes, let's don't look at that. Let's look at the additional tax, just the new tax it would take to pay for it. $660,000 in tax per person, every single person. Most people don't even pay $600,000 in tax total, and this would be additional tax. And then they said, well, you can pay for it in 10 years. Okay, so $60,000 in new tax per year for 10 years. And that's every taxpayer. So that includes the restaurant, the bartenders. So for each bartender that doesn't pay their share, somebody's paying the extra. The point is, Sanders is very, very progressive. His budget doesn't ever balance, but he has a large following of people. And all my point is, without being partisan, because I'm not, the point is that there's a large number of Americans who support him, and they are not on board with this middle-of-the-road Biden moderate campaign that he ran. So I believe this is going to be a problem, and it won't be long. And the key inflection point will be when the cabinet's in place and the Senate vote is finished and policies start coming up and progressives have no voice, if they have no voice. Now, if they win the 2 Georgia seats and Biden steps aside and Kamala Harris comes to the front, this could all change. But assuming Biden stays in, he doesn't win Georgia, and he has trouble getting his progressive agenda through, and God forbid, everything kind of looks the same as it's been for the last 4 years. The economics don't change, the taxes don't change, the regulations don't change, and the unbiased people look and say, how much has changed other than the red-haired guy in the office? if that becomes the case, which is, some would say, the most likely outcome, the progressives, I believe, are going to find themselves increasingly frustrated and tempted to have their own party. And so the Democratic Party will split into two. Whether they actually do it or whether just ideologically they just keep bumping heads and stay under the same umbrella to try to get votes, it remains to be seen. But I believe that that tension is very real. And I think if the numbers are correct that the progressive movement in the US is growing, I think that tension is only going to get worse and worse. And it's hard to say how it resolves itself. One way is by an election. So in this case, the progressives were willing to hide under the Democratic umbrella just to get rid of the man they hate, Trump. But how often is that going to happen? How often is a candidate going to be so hated that they can come together? I don't know. I doubt it will happen in the future. So I suspect they will find a way to separate themselves. So on the right, the same thing. You know, if these super conservative, religious, Christian, super conservative people try to reform themselves, mean gather together again, do they have consensus to have their own independent Republican Party, or will they try to hijack the Republican Party back to what it was? It remains to be seen. I don't see that there's enough momentum or support for that to happen. I think that the Republican Party is forever changed. They will still be to the right, but I think they will be moderate at worst. The extreme on the right will be something different, not religious. Okay, so the question is, are Republicans better stewards of the economy? And I would say that, or Democrats. And what I would say is that's a very controversial subject. The consensus opinion would be that Democrats are less focused on the economy. So by definition, they wouldn't try to run a campaign, vote for me based off the economy. Whereas Republicans have consistently for 100 years tried to say they do better. So the fact that they even make the effort says one thing. But if you look at historical numbers, I believe depending on how you measure the US economy, that's another thing. Do you measure it by GDP or the stock market? But what has been better for at least the stock market, and I'm not sure, but I would think the GDP as well, has been divided government. That has been consistent for like 100 years. If one president has the presidency, the House, and the Senate all under the same political party, they're able to force through more legislation and more change, but it's been worse for the economy. So from those two metrics, you can put together what your decision is. The Democrats also can say, well, under Bill Clinton, we had a great stock market, a great economy. Detractors would say, well, yeah, that was the dot-com era. You had the explosion in technology. It had nothing to do with the president. I would just say that those are kind of the discussion points, but there's not a consensus one way or the other. Okay,
so how bad will the damage be?
So the question is about the Texas claim to overthrow the presidency. So recently, I believe it was in the last couple days, the state of Texas got 17 states together to challenge the election results. And the claim is that there was election fraud and that the results are not accurate and that there needs to be either an investigation or both or a recount. And the question is, what happens if they win? And then I guess it was unasked, but how likely could that happen? I'll just start with my own question. How likely is that to happen? From everything I've read, and I haven't read a lot, it seems very unlikely. For better or for worse, the way the US system is set up, each state has their own ability to decide how they vote. So the rules of what is fair and legal counting of votes and what is fair and legal methods to vote is different state to state. So Texas certified their results. No one's challenging it. So for Texas to say, I'm offended that Pennsylvania didn't count their votes correctly, doesn't have technically legal standing. So even though they're trying to fight the fight, I think under the current format, they don't have legal standing. So I think it's not going to go through. But there is a lot of people in this country who feel that there were irregularities, there were inappropriate votes cast and counted, and there are problems with the confidence of the votes. And I can tell you myself, I've seen videos and I've seen interviews that certainly highlight that there was a lot of irregularity, there was a lot of shenanigans. But at the end of the day, if there's not enough to change the outcome, then what is there to do? If you can say 2,000 people fraudulently voted, 1,000 dead people voted, but if the margin of victory is 20,000, then what is there to do? So I feel confident that the Supreme Court will not take on any challenges that don't result in a change in outcome. So if there's 1,000 dead people that voted in Pennsylvania, I don't think they're going to opine on that. They're going to say it doesn't change the election, we don't care. But if some crazy scenario where the president did get reversed and Trump stays, I feel a very likely outcome is there will be rioting and looting and mass destruction, and yeah, there'll be mayhem. That's just the history of the way it's gone, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's correct or not correct. That's the way that they express themselves. So, but it doesn't look likely. Trumpism. What is Trumpism? We talked about Trumpism is here with us, even with or without the man. So America first, liberal immigration policies, or less liberal immigration policies, free trade policies, unilateral versus multilateral, and progressive ideas, and non-interventionism on foreign policy. Those ideas have resonated very deeply. Like I said, 74 million people in this country voted for this guy. So those things are not likely to change, no matter who's in office. So the question is, do politicians gravitate to those policies even without the man? Or do they go back to the old way now that he has potentially exited? My view, and a few others, as I showed, is that those policies will probably still be here. It's going to be hard to get elected if you aren't in line with some of these policies. If you have exceptional reasons, I think Biden wants to go back to the Paris Accord. There's Democratic support for that. So even though that's multilateral, people are very green energy focused. So they'll use that as the excuse to be non-Trumpism. So there are exceptions. But in general, he has changed politics for a long time. That's all I have, unless there's more questions. Is there more questions? Okay, so there's two questions, and it has to do with the safety net in the United States for people who are adversely affected by COVID, and I believe how are people just coping in general, and then there's the savings. How are Americans saving? So the numbers are pretty clear.
Yeah, well, there's safety nets.
Yeah, so in general, it's been a long time that the US and Europe have had a disparity in their safety nets. Americans have prided themselves on pro-business, lean corporations that don't have large safety nets, but they're more efficient, larger GDP growth in the United States, but shallower safety nets because we want to encourage people who are unemployed to get back to work. So a key to that is the unemployment rate should never be what you were making as an employed person, because you need that motivation to get back to work. So unemployment has historically been set to be a fractional amount of your current pay, and always as an incentive to get back to work. But during the pandemic, Trump again broke the rules, and for whatever reason, maybe it was because of bipartisanship, maybe it was because of compassion, but they decided to pay unemployment that was historically above and beyond what's ever been done in the United States. And again, part of this can be said to be the progressive movement and people in America now feeling that the government needs to play a bigger role. Again, even Republicans somehow feel this responsibility, right? So they agreed to a package that paid people more, in some cases, to get unemployment than to actually work. The really strong conservative Republicans were offended, they were upset, but in bipartisanship, they let it go through. What that resulted in is the economy had a big pickup. If you notice, the GDP and jobs recovery has been much quicker than anticipated out of the low of the COVID. And the second is that the savings rate, which is the second part of the question, the savings rate has grown dramatically. And you see that American savings rate is up dramatically in 2020 than in previous years. And most people say it's because of this safety net that was provided. But that safety net has run out, and that's why this next stimulus is a big deal. Are they going to reinsert the previous stimulus, which is above and beyond potentially what they made, or are they going to go back to what the Europeans call the stingy version of unemployment and pay them only what the states are paying? Or are they going to let the federal government top it off with an extra $600 a week? That's why this stimulus package is such a big deal. At $900 billion, trust me, employers are not giving, unemployed people are not getting money in savings. If they do the $3 trillion, then yeah, they're going to start saving again and they're going to start buying and shopping and spending. But what does that do to the economy? We'll see. So that's why everyone's really focused on this next stimulus package, what's going to happen. And Biden is more concerned. He wants $3 trillion, but unless these two senators get elected, he probably can't. He'll be lucky to get $1 trillion. So we'll see. So in summary, I would say that 2020 has been a tumultuous year. Obviously, a lot of changes. In general, a lot of the trends that have been accelerated due to COVID were already in progress, and now they've just been accelerated. But the return to normal is not likely to be the old normal. It's likely to be a new normal, and it remains to be seen how that normal will look. But I do not believe that normal will look like it did in 2019. There will be industries that are completely reshaped, potentially political parties reshaped, and hopefully for the better, but regardless, things will be changing. So let's hope for the best, let's be smart, let's move forward intelligently, and let's make good decisions so that we can move forward with what hand we've been dealt.